But yeah, it's fairly beginner guide to Farcaster data. We'll kind of talk through just a few things. I think a lot of people get confused about like, where does the data actually live? What's on-chain, what's in hubs, what's in clients, what's in servers. So we'll kind of talk through that, and then I'll also pause and answer questions there, because normally people have questions. I don't know how many people are Farcaster experts here. Next, we'll talk about analyzing Farcaster data. I think there's a lot of fun opportunities you get when you combine both social data and on-chain data. So I'll be showcasing a few dashboards that kind of put that into context. And lastly, the most fun part is building applications on Farcaster. I think there's hopefully everyone here has heard of Frames, and we'll get a demo on Frames later. But I think it's a kind of a new paradigm and a new stack of like how you think about building apps because of all of the open data that you have access to. So I'll pause after each section, answer questions. Don't be scared. There's no dumb questions. So let's talk about the contracts, hubs, and clients. So can everyone see that? Is that too small for anyone? Is it too small? No? It's pretty small. All right, I'm going to point and read as I go. If you can't read something, let me know and I'll read it out loud. But essentially, there's three parts. You have the contracts, which I'll talk through. You have hubs, which is a gossip network, which is just essentially nodes talking to each other and saying, hey, XYZ posted this or that. And then you have kind of clients that run their own hubs and also have their own app and backend. Right, so running through that more in detail, on-chain contracts, you have an ID registry, a storage registry, and a key registry, right? So these are three separate contracts that live on Optimism. So like if you went into Warpcast and you were to sign up for an account, you probably have seen that you do like an in-app purchase or use Coinbase Commerce. I think they still use that. And essentially what that's going to do is it's going to spin up an address for you in your wallet, and they're also going to then make a transaction on chain to give you a FID, to get you storage units. I think it's 2 to start out with. And then also a signer key for publishing on Warpcast, for example. Right. So technically, like if anyone here has used Lens, like Lens, you actually go to the site and you claim your handle, you connect your wallet, and you kind of like buy your account on chain. Like technically the same thing is happening with Farcaster, except they handle that part for you because it's kind of better UX. But that's also why, like, if you look at the people who are registering for Farcaster, you're like, oh, all these wallets have no activity. They must be bots. And it's like, no, it's not because they're bots. It's just because that's the UX that Farcaster or Warpcast, which is a client on Farcaster, has kind of chosen for its users. Right. So once you have the IDs and the keys and the storage units, now you can kind of move into hubs. So hubs are kind of the actual code, and like the code that you run hubs with is called Hubble. It's kind of the same thing as Geth. And so the hub will read from on-chain from these contracts to at least know like who has permissions to sign, who has what ID, and like for the given ID of a user, do they have enough storage units to cover like a message or a cast per se, right? And hubs are where like hashed messages are stored. So everything from casts to links. So links is if I choose to follow someone, but they call it links because you could have multiple different kinds of links. Following someone is just one type of link, right? You have reactions. So reaction type equals 1 is a like, reaction type equals 2 is a recast. Anyone could add like type equals 3, type equals 4, whatever in their own client to have it mean something else, right? So there's reactions. There's verifications, which is just I sign a message with my ETH wallet, like stating that I own a certain like the FID custody address, right? So that's the same as like if you went on Guild and like you're just basically proving your account ownership to get access to some Telegram group. That's the same thing, and that's stored as a verification on the hub, right? So the theme here is that mainly all of like the key interaction data is hashed and stored on hubs, and they have hubs that kind of share with each other all of that data as it's pushed to the hub, right? So how does pushing to a hub actually work? This is where you have clients come in, right? So Warpcast is an app built on a hub. The app structure is basically the same as something like Twitter in terms of like they host their own like front end or mobile app. So like the mobile app for Warpcast is not decentralized. It's not like they have different Warpcast hubs per se, right? The Warpcast app itself is centralized. They have their own backend, their own AWS database and whatnot, where they handle the client logic. But when someone casts on Warpcast, Warpcast will then basically save it in their backend, send it to their hub, and then the other hubs kind of closest to Warpcast hub will receive that cast, and it'll slowly go through the network until it goes to like some other client's hub, right? So Supercast has their own hub as well. Sometimes you'll notice delays between like, oh, if I use like Nanar's API, so like Nanar has their own hub, and I push something through Nanar's API, it takes time to show up on Warpcast because sometimes it doesn't really get lost, but it's like it takes this time kind of walking through hubs. And we'll share the link to this PowerPoint later, and there's Varun kind of did a 5-minute video and that he uploaded to Warpcast, kind of talking through the hub and like gossip network structure more deeply, right? So clients have their own like specific data. Like you'll notice here, like, oh, frames aren't on here, you know, and I'm gonna walk through that next, but that kind of helps you better understand like the on-chain part's just for registration. The hub is where like all of these messages are stored and it reads from the contracts. The clients read from the hub and post to the hub, right? Okay, people don't look lost yet, which is good. Cool, so I like to use this layer diagram because it really wasn't until, and this is from, I think, Starkware's docs, not the Farcaster part, but they had their own docs. This was the first time like when I was looking at Farcaster that I was like, all right, L2s, L3s, L4s kind of make more sense to me now, right? Because technically, if you think of like rollups, all it is like you have some base layer and you have a layer on top that's posting some proof or reading some data from it, right? So you have the on-chain contracts, which are technically like the L1. The hubs are reading from the contracts. They're kind of like an L2. You have these other clients built on top that have their own data, part of which is posted to the hubs. And then you have frames, which is a Warpcast specific concept that are kind of pushing and talking to the Warpcast client, right? I think now some of these other clients supported the frame standard, so technically could go multiple ways, but like mentally, that's how I think of the structure and how I think about like the data hierarchy of like, if there's something on chain here, I can probably get that from a hub, which means I can probably get that from Warpcast, which means I can probably access that from a frame. But if I turn it the other way around, there's kind of like loss of data, right? It just makes it easier for me as like an analyst and developer to know how to navigate the kind of like information hierarchy here. Because one of the things you're going to run into, or maybe have already run into when you're developing with this, or developing on Farcaster, is you're just like, where the heck is this data point? I don't know. Do I go to a hub API? Do I go to Dune's API? Do I go to like Nanar's API? Do I have to look for like Warpcast's hidden internal APIs to like get the data? So I made this little diagram here, which hopefully is big enough to be seen. But this is something you can kind of refer back to in the future in terms of like where the data, like what data is stored where and like how to extract it. So if you wanted like the FID registry transactions, storage unit transactions, key transactions, you just extract that the way that you would normally extract on-chain data, which is through RPCs or with Dune. If you want this hub data, then you have Nanar or you have Dune that ingests from Nanar, or you can run your own hub. If you want stuff like warps, DMs, channel follows, frames, that a lot of it's not really exposed. I think Warpcast might expose their own like client APIs, and Nanar ingests some of them like channel follows. I don't really know how that's set up, but I'm assuming that's because Warpcast has kind of given them an API. And then you have frames, so such like frame actions. Like if I interact with a frame, Warpcast will send that like JSON request to the backend server hosting the frame, but Warpcast doesn't store that frame interaction, and that does not get committed to hubs. Or I mean, Warpcast could store in their backend, but like theoretically, it's like, you know, it's kind of just stored on the frame side. Same thing with frame transactions. That's kind of like a frame-specific concept. So anyone who's kind of saying, oh, I want to access frame interaction data and query it on Dune or whatnot, it's not something you can do right now because kind of as you move down the level, it becomes less queryable. It's a little less open. And that's just kind of something that developers have to deal with and like build more tooling around and probably more middleware around as the ecosystem grows. So analyzing Farcaster data, this is the fun stuff. So probably most of us here have seen these charts from our good friend Pixel Hack, kind of showing the growth of the network. We can see daily average users based off of like cast and reaction volume kind of peaked right when frames came out and dropped a little, and they're kind of coming back. So like the activity on the network is quote unquote strong, and we'll get into that. Registrations peaked also around frames, but registrations have come down and not really gone back up yet. I think anyone who's on Warpcast probably actually does feel this as a user of like, there is a lot of kind of like spam and whatnot from new accounts right now. And like, I think that's something the Warpcast team is actively working on, which brings me to like some of the fun that data analysts have been having, because we have Nanar data on Dune and we also have on-chain data on Dune. So we can do kind of like user analysis at a much deeper level to be like, what is the quality of a user? And like, how do we use that to create not just spam filters, but like recommendation systems, token systems, and whatnot. So I built a dashboard. It's linked down there. If you go on Dune and you search Farcaster Explorer or Farcaster Trends, you'll see it. I won't really walk through it in this demo because I don't know how much time I have. But something I've done here is just take all active casters. It's probably way too small for people to read. But I'll just read here, like there's active tier. So I kind of tiered users into 5. You have NPC, which for people who don't play video games, it just means you're a computer. There's active, which follow the active badge kind of like system that Warpcast had. You have star, influencer, and VIP, right? So this idea was like, all right, let's take their casting activity and their engagement level, give them a tier, and then also look at like how many channels are they in, whether they're the top channels, top domains that they share, who are their reply guys, and I also added in like how many transactions have they done on chain, how many contracts have they deployed, what's their total NFT DEX volume. Right. So once you kind of have, and I'll read like some interesting ones here, like Vitalik is very active in Ethereum, geopolitics, and USA. The top domains he shares is semaphore.com and Wikipedia on mobile, which is interesting because Dan shares mostly Wikipedia like desktop links, which makes me think maybe he's mainly casting from his desktop instead of from his phone. And then one way that I've been teaching people to use this is like, let's say you want to do a CRM for finding like top developers on Base, for example. You would go to the dashboard, and I made it so you can filter through parameters like, I want to find the people that Jesse Pollock has interacted with in the last 14 days and sort those users by users who are less than 30 days old and have deployed the most amount of on-chain contracts on Base. Right, so you could start filtering that way, and you'd probably see 5 to 6. I've been using this consistently myself. Okay, I've been using this consistently myself to kind of find developers to talk to that are interesting and rising. Right, so that's useful for DevRel teams, marketing teams, partnership teams, because it's like a lot of the time we're looking at top contract developers that were deploying on chain, but didn't have much else data to work with. They didn't have people to reach out to. They're just like, there's some dev who took like half of our testnet ETH and is just deploying contracts, and we can't track where they actually work, you know? So I'm gonna quickly run into the last part, which is, I think the most fun part for me, is like, there's a lot of open data that you get to work with here, and I think that changes the nature of applications that you see. So I've separated it into, you have 4 layers for your app, right? You have the people layer, which is like either passive, active, or race style curation. So passive is stuff like Kiwi, where it's like the top casts by different themes are kind of rated by how many people liked it. Active is like degen tips or bounty caster, where there is an actual action people have to take to interact. Race is something like launch caster, where it's like the first person to spot a new launch gets some sort of reward or clout, right? Bots are super interesting. I think using tools like Nanar, Dune, ChatGPT, Airstack, like traditional Discord bot tooling, because the data is open and it's cheap to access, there's a ton of unexplored space here, especially because bots can build on top of bots. Currently building a bot that builds on top of Bountycaster, and it's free. I don't have to ask Linda for permission. I don't have to ask like the Nanar or Warpcast team for permission. I can just build on top and see how users respond, right? Front ends, I think this is something we're still not really exploring because people can just build things into Warpcast, but like you can either choose to build a simple frame with Frog, or you can build your whole client. And I think we're kind of seeing this quicker iteration of like teams like Bountycaster iterating with frames first before they go and build something into their web app. Like they've had a pretty simple web app for the last like year or so. And contracts, this is something I think that's also still very much unexplored. There's great tools such as like Stations contracts, Syndicate, Zora, Privy, where you can basically build a lot more behind the scenes for the user and kind of like tie this together in kind of like a continued loop, right? So you can choose to only use one part of the stack. You can choose to build with multiple. So Bountycaster, I think it's been super fun to kind of watch how they've grown. If you're curious about it, just look at their early bounties versus their current bounties. And you can see like they started very simple with like just people and like an LLM bot. And like as they kind of got some traction with people kind of creating bounties and confirming them and like figuring out what is the main flow of like create, edit, delete, complete, they built out a simple web app. And once the app kind of somewhat got traction, they're like, okay, some of the things that people were trying to do in the app or like DMing us for, let's build into a frame, right? And they're able to really iterate on that in like a Web3 native way. And then in the future, they can kind of tackle more complex bounty flows. They're now building a more complex web app, and they can actually build contracts in, right? But in the past, like if they wanted to do Bountycast, they would have had to do some sort of on-chain contract first, spend 6 to 9 months like figuring out the contract, making it safe, getting it audited before they could build out any of the rest of this. So I think it gives application devs a lot more flexibility. They've been testing since October. They've had over 400K of like bounty values. I think 50% of their bounties have been completed. I think they're a super interesting kind of case study for like watching how a team gets to iterate on this kind of new stack. And I have a dashboard there for anyone who wants to look into it. I know I kind of sped through the rest because I might have spent too much time answering data questions. But if you have questions, feel free to come up to me after. I'm happy to discuss any of this stuff, help you guys out with any data needs. Dune does have an API that's easy to pull Farcaster data and on-chain data from. So if you want to build with Dune's API, I'm also very happy to help with that. And that is my job. So that's all I have. Thank you.